LPC. Today we'll have a talk from Béatrice Lienemann on Plato on the explanatory role of forms and definition. All right, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me here. So thank you for the invitation. I think it's better to stand up, so I don't like that too much, but I think it's better. And I will just read through my paper. I hope it's not too annoying to do that, but I think it's the best thing for me to do. The topic of my talk today is the complex relation between forms or ideas and definitions in Plato. A straightforward conjecture about this relation might be that to define things like justice or beauty, one must refer to the corresponding form, so the form of justice or the form of beauty. Even if this conjecture points in the right direction, however, Plato did not present it out of the blue. It was, I take it, a very long chain of reasoning and trial and error that led Plato, Socrates, and/or Plato to this view. The aim of my presentation is to trace this line of reasoning and trial and error as accurately as possible by looking at various crucial passages from the early so-called Socratic dialogues. The main purpose of this analysis is to better understand how Plato eventually came to believe that only forms are suitable for fulfilling the paradigmatic and explanatory requirements that any definiens in a correct definition must satisfy. I begin with some preliminary remarks on very general issues pertaining to reading Plato and speaking about Socratic dialogues. This is primarily to explain my approach and some of the methodological assumptions I will be making. I then outline by referring to key passages in various dialogues the three main conditions for correct definition that Socrates compels his interlocutors to identify and acknowledge. These conditions are the following. The first is the substitutivity requirement. The second is the paradigmatic or paradigm requirement, and the third one is the explanatory requirement. The identification of these conditions is inherently linked to the question of which things are suitable for fulfilling them. In other words, what are the appropriate definientia for the thought definienda, so the things to be defined. My argument is essentially the following. Even though it is in certain cases conceivable that things other than forms could fulfill the three conditions and provide an appropriate definiens, the operatic discussions in some early dialogues show that in other cases of particular interest, the paradigmatic requirement and the explanatory requirement can only be satisfied by objects of a very special kind, namely forms. Consequently, it can be said that the need to posit forms, which are by their nature eternal, invariable, immaterial, and perfect things of a certain kind, arises, among other reasons, from the conditions that are essential for an appropriate definition. For only forms are, according to Plato, entities capable of fully satisfying the explanatory and paradigmatic constraints on correct definitions. So first, some preliminary remarks on the textual basis. The main textual basis for my investigation encompasses early dialogues by Plato. So not all early dialogues, but only half of it, approximately. Specifically, the Charmides, the Euthyphro, the Hippias Major, the Laches, the Lysis, and the first book of the Republic. But I will only refer to some of those, so to the Euthyphro, to the Hippias Major, and the Laches. My focus lies on the emergence of a specific view regarding definition, and I believe that some early dialogues demonstrate the extent to which the notion of definition was in the process of being developed at this time. A crucial part of this endeavor is gaining a clear understanding of what adequate definitions require. In the early dialogues, Plato has Socrates examine the questions of how certain things must be properly understood and investigate why possible answers are flawed and fall short of adequately capturing the thing sought. By earlier Socratic dialogues, I mean those in which Socrates is the main interlocutor, in which the ending is aporetic, and which examine mainly practical ethical questions. When they do address theoretical issues, this is not their primary focus, but rather secondary to the practical interest. Furthermore, I assume that the theory of forms is absent from these dialogues in the sense that it is not explicitly introduced. This, of course, does not rule out the possibility that one might also detect allusions to the theory of forms in them retrospectively, so once one acquainted with the middle dialogues. Still, I consider the absence of any explicit reference to forms in the full sense to be a distinguishing feature of the early dialogues. Finally, I abstain from judging the historical question of when Plato, as the author of these dialogues, developed and adopted the theory of forms. When it comes to the topic of definitions, the Socrates of the early dialogues does not regard the search for correct definitions or for criteria for good definitions as an end in itself. Rather, his interest in definitions stems from his prominent ethical concern. His inquiries are directed towards all that proves relevant to the question of the good life. During the various discussions, it then transpires that the answer to the question of how to live well presupposes that one will gain a clearer understanding of the nature of the main virtues, such as courage, temperance, justice, piety, and the special case of the beautiful, or the fine, to kalon. The fact that Socrates denies having positive knowledge of the virtues is another characteristic feature of the early dialogues. In the Sophistical Refutations, Aristotle reports that, I quote, Socrates used to ask questions and not to answer them, for he used to confess that he did not know. End of quote. Because these dialogues fail to provide an adequate account of the nature of different virtues, they end in aporia. Some see this as a major difficulty for the early dialogues. Peter Geach famously coined the term Socratic fallacy to describe the methodological circle caused by the assumption that one cannot know anything about a subject X unless one first knows what X is, or in other words, unless one first knows the definition of X. I shall confine myself here to two remarks on this issue. First, various convincing answers to Geach's objection have been presented by different scholars, all of which aim to distinguish in some way between two kinds of knowledge. So yeah, I'm thinking of, for example, the first one, maybe Gregory Vlastos, and then cases like Terry Irwin or Michael Farrell-John. I believe it is completely justified to attribute to Socrates an implicit distinction between two types of knowledge of different strength. The alternative is that one must accuse Socrates of a fundamental inconsistency when it comes to his arguments and reasoning on the one hand and his practice on the other, a reading that should only be the last resort if one follows a principle of charity. My second remark, I don't regard the early dialogues primarily as dialogues of definition, in which possessing a correct definition is a prerequisite for all further inquiry. Rather, I'm inclined to view these dialogues as instead highlighting the various difficulties, or the aporiae, into which one falls without definitions. The early dialogues therefore ultimately motivate the theoretical need for adequate definitions in the first place, rather than assuming that need from the outset. So my second bunch of preliminary remarks concerns Socrates and also Plato's interests. So there, let us consider Aristotle's account of Socrates and Plato's interests in Book Alpha and Mu of the Metaphysics. So I marked, so this is text T1 and T2, and I emphasized in bold the parts that refer to Socrates, and in italics the one that refer to Plato. I won't read all the quotes, only that the passages or the parts that seem important or that will be important for what I'm saying afterwards. So I quote, having been from his youth familiar first with Cratylus and the Heraclitean doctrines, that all sensible things are always flowing and that there is no knowledge about them, these views he, i.e. Plato, held also later. Socrates, on the other hand, was occupied with ethical matters, not at all with the whole nature, but was seeking in them what is universal and was the first in his thought on definitions. Plato, accepting him, assumed for the above sort of reason that this is done with regard to other things and not to some sensible thing, for a common definition of a sensible object is impossible as they are always changing. And the second, T2, Socrates, on the other hand, was studying moral virtues and was the first to search for universal definitions of them. Socrates had good reason to search for what something is, for he was inquiring into syllogistic reasoning and what something serves as a starting point for syllogisms. Two things may have been rightly ascribed to Socrates: inductive arguments and universal definitions, which are both related to the starting point of knowledge. But Socrates did not make the universal or the definitions separate. They, however, gave them separate existence, and these sort of beings they called ideas or forms. This committed them, almost by the same reasoning, to postulate ideas for every universal term. Aristotle makes some interesting points here. Regarding Socrates, he states that he was occupied by ethical matters and was not interested in natural philosophy. He further notes that Socrates' study of ethical virtues sparked his interest in the search for universal definitions, insofar as he seemed to assume that answering these questions, the question of how we ought to live, requires finding universal definitions for evaluative terms or things, so for the virtues. Regarding Plato, Aristotle refers to his being influenced in his youth by Cratylus and Heraclitus. Regardless of the historical accuracy of this diagnosis, what strikes me as correct and important is the identification of the specific reason that led Plato to assume forms as the foundation of universal definitions and knowledge. Because sensible things are changing, perhaps even always in flux, it is impossible to have a common definition and knowledge of them. Why? I don't believe it is necessary to attribute to Plato the assumption that sensible objects are constantly changing, so always flowing. Rather, he holds that for any given sensible object F, it is always possible for it to be at the same time both F and not F. So the contrary of being F or being other than being F in at least some respect. By contrast, for a definition of Fness and knowledge of Fness, it is, according to Plato, necessary that the F never be not F in any respect. If this criterion is not met, no common definition of Fness and consequently no knowledge of Fness is possible. One can, or one might call this the argument from relativity. Variations of this argument appear regularly in different guises in Plato's dialogues. The examination of Protagoras' homo mensura principle falls under this heading, so the heading what I'm calling argument from relativity. Protagoras' position is in fact one of the most important encounters, for I take it that Plato regarded the homo mensura principle as a genuine challenge and Protagoras as a serious opponent. So now, let us now turn to how Socrates' interest in definitions emerged. Here is one example from the Hippias Major. So this is T3, a dialogue, so an early dialogue that focuses on the question of the nature of to kalon, so the beautiful. The Greek term for beautiful, kalon, also has a moral sense, which explains why many scholars prefer to translate it also as fine. I quote, "Just now someone got me badly stuck when I was finding fault with parts of some speeches for being ugly and praising other parts as beautiful. He questioned me this way really insultingly. Socrates, how do you know what sorts of things are beautiful and ugly? Look, would you be able to say what the beautiful is?" Ts dintor kalon. Here, Socrates introduces the anonymous interlocutor, a device he only uses in the Hippias Major. The description of this, his conversation with the anonymous interlocutor is, however, strikingly, or maybe except the insulting style, strikingly reminiscent of the way in which Socrates typically deals with interlocutors elsewhere. The conversation begins with a seemingly harmless exchange on the affairs of daily life, demonstrating that the interlocutors are competent language users, that for example, that certain actions or customs are fine and beautiful while others are ugly or bad, or aischon. Yet when asked what it is that various things with the same name have in common, in our case, what the beautiful is, the interlocutors suddenly find themselves in great difficulty and prove incapable of answering the questions about the general character shared by different eponyms. Thus, a question of definition, or rather determination, is raised. It is noteworthy that the question is raised without the use of any particular terminology. In fact, Socrates does not make use of any technical vocabulary, as Aristotle later will. So, although we find the noun horos and the verb horitzein, so horos usually translated by definition and horitzein by defining in Aristotle. So we find these two terms also in Plato, but not the term or the noun horismos. These terms are not yet confined to the narrow technical notion of definition and defining in Plato, instead used in the more general sense of boundary in the case of horos, or to delimit, to separate, to mark in the case of horitzein. What interests me now is a step that often arises first in discussions in the early dialogues, as it does in the Hippias Major shortly after the passage just considered. This is T4. So I will only read parts of it. So this is the question. I shall answer that by justice. And is this justice something? Very much so. And by wisdom the wise are wise, and by the good all good things are good. How could they be otherwise? Could they be otherwise? By these being something, they are. Then all beautiful things true are beautiful by the beautiful. Isn't that so? Yes, by the beautiful. By that being something, it is. Here in the it is emphasized. So in the emphasized sentences, Socrates asked whether justice, wisdom, and the good are something or not, using the phrase estin ti tutor, which is composed with the pronoun tutos for something. What is meant by these questions of the type is x something? In the Protagoras, a similar question or an equivalent one, I take it, is framed by asking, then are you saying that, for example, piety is a certain thing, so a pragma? And this is text 5, so these are again the emphasized parts. So for example, in C2, this thing, or again, at the beginning, first as follows, is justice a certain thing or no thing? So here we have pragma or uden pragma, and later on, this thing you just named, justice, is it itself just or unjust? So here, this thing is tutor to pragma. And again, in the last part, pragma shows up again. How ought we to understand the question of whether piety or the pious is a pragma? What is its existential impact? Opinions on this issue diverge significantly. Jean-François Prado claims in his commentary on the Hippias Major that this question rules out the possibility that just and good are merely common names for various things or signify a quality attributed to different things. Rather, according to Prado, the question establishes the claim that justice and the good are real realities that exist independently of the things that share common properties and which are the cause of those things having properties in common. So in French, he says, ce qui signifie que le beau et la justice existent indépendamment de la belle marmite ou de l'homme juste, ces qualités ou déterminations sont elles-mêmes des réalités déterminées qui produisent des effets qui existent par elles-mêmes. So this is quite strong. Dancy, by contrast, holds that the function of these questions is simply to fix, I quote, fix the topic of the following discussion, or he says, these are ways of isolating the subject to be discussed. But they say nothing about the structure of the really real, and are not used here to establish a strong ontological claim. I would agree that Prado's interpretation is an overtly strong reading of these phrases. His view is representative of those authors who see a link between these phrases and similar formulations in the later dialogues through which the existence of forms is established. Even if there is a linguistic similarity here, these questions in the early dialogues seem to express merely low-level existential claims. Through his questions, Socrates explores whether pious or just things, persons, or actions have anything in common. That is, whether they are participants or instances, or preferably instances of the same virtue. He is motivated by the aim of excluding a relativist or a subjectivist position according to which justice or piety is measured in relation to an individual or a group or to certain circumstances, such that there is no common objective standard for them. By contrast, Socrates probes whether and to what extent the unity and the existence of virtues shared by various instances, so persons, actions, or things, can be accepted by asking whether virtues such as justice and piety are pragmata, things. Socrates is not necessarily already making certain ontological assumptions about them. Rather, this is a way of drawing attention to the relationship between names, onomata, and entities, pragmata, so as reference of those names. Later in the Protagoras, there's a very interesting passage that refers to the one we have seen, in which Socrates poses Protagoras the following question. So this is text 6. The question, I think, was this: wisdom, temperance, courage, justice, and piety, are these five, which are 5 names for one thing, or for each of the names is there one particular being and thing underlying, each having a capacity of its own? You said that they were not names for one thing, but each of these names was allotted to a peculiar thing, and all these were parts of excellence. Here, pragma is used to refer to what a name denotes. Socrates raises the question of whether the various names for the virtues are simply different designations for the same subject, so terms with the same meaning but different senses, or whether they are in fact not only different names but also refer to different objects, in this case different virtues that are distinct parts of virtue. Socrates is thus tackling the relationship between names and the things to which they refer in order to examine a substantive question concerning the unity of the virtues or the relationship between the virtues. In doing so, he is making an existential claim insofar as he makes it clear that the names do indeed denote something objective and are not merely accidentally the same names. However, he is not making any further ontological claims about the nature of these references. to wrap up, what is conceded in the above considered discussion in the Hippias Major and the Protagoras? First, I think that the subject under discussion is something that exists. So there is the subject to be discussed. And second, that this thing, the pragma, is something that must exist if different things are to share a property. For that thing which is conceded to exist is also what makes the other things as they are. So in other words, we see here a connection between the existential admission and the assumption that things are F because F or because the F or Fness exists. This clearly hints at two of the three conditions that proper definitions must satisfy, the paradigmatic and the explanatory requirements, to which I will now turn. But I start with the first requirement, the substitutivity requirement. So as we have seen, Socrates does not directly provide a theory of definition. We will see how he proceeds when he progressively identifies the necessary conditions on which a proper definition, a theory of definition can be constructed. Such a theory can be reconstructed by examining the counter-arguments and objections Socrates uses to reject the various proposed definitions, and by looking at the additions or modifications proposed to avoid the difficulties thus revealed. This allows us to identify the necessary requirements that proper definitions must satisfy. So the main conditions of adequacy for definitions are the following. So I gave the name at the beginning, but here are definitions of those requirements. And here I'm adopting the formulation of those requirements from the book of Dancy. So the book, what's the title? So I don't, but it's this On the Theory of Forms by Plato, so from 2004. So the first requirement is the substitutivity requirement. It can be defined as its definiens of a definition must be substitutable sala veritate for its definiendum. The paradigmatic or paradigm requirement can be defined as follows. Its definiens must give a paradigm or standard by comparison with which cases of its definiendum may be determined. And the explanatory requirement is its definiens must explain the application of its definiendum. And now I will discuss a bit more in detail the three requirements. We can find all three requirements, or at least allusions to the requirements, in a short passage from in the Euthyphro, and this is text 7. Then do you remember that I did not direct you to teach me this, some one or two of the many things, but that form itself by which all the pious things are pious? For you said, I think, that it is by one idea that the impious things are impious and the pious things pious. Or don't you recall? I certainly do. Then teach me this idea, what it is. So looking to it and using it as an example, whatever is such as it is among the things either you or anyone else does, I shall say is pious, and whatever is not such, I shall say is not. So in brackets, you have the abbreviations of the three requirements. So these are the passages which may we express the three requirements. Here we encounter a typical way of expressing the three requirements, so SR, ER, and PR. It is, however, useful to examine the conditions separately so as better grasp their respective meanings and functions. I shall start with the substitutivity requirement, which is probably the clearest and also most universally accepted criterion for a good definition, or for an appropriate definition. This requirement can be formulated either for predicates or for singular terms. So predicates X is F, or for singular terms of the type either the F or Fness, referring to the subject of the sentence. So when the requirement is designed for predicates, the definiens must give necessary and sufficient condition so that it meets the definiendum. So this is nec suf. So a candidate definition can be criticized and refuted by counterexamples in which either the definiens is not a necessary condition for the application of the definiendum. So if we define J by ABC, in this case, it is not the case that if X is F, if X is J, then X is ABC, or the definiens is not a sufficient condition for the application of the definiendum, then the definition J is defined by ABC can be refuted by saying that it is not the case that if X is ABC, X is J. So the former occurs when the case satisfies the definiens but not the definiendum, while the latter holds for cases that satisfy the definiendum but not the definiens. So now we will see examples for both possible objections in the text, so in the Laches. So we can see counterexamples of both types in the early dialogues, the Laches, so which treats the question of what is courage or what are courageous, what is the courageous. And Laches' first attempt to define who is courageous is D1C. So first definition of courage, X is, and here it is framed with a predicate, X is courageous, defined by X stands his ground. So this attempt seems to fulfill the sufficiency criterion of the definition, but not the necessity. It's not a necessary condition. So this proposal fails to deliver a correct definition insofar as the definiens does not provide a necessary condition for being courageous, so this is in the text, there are situations in which it is courageous to retreat, so not to stand one's ground. Then Laches makes a second attempt, which is the following. So the second attempt now it is formulated by referring to the noun, so to courage. Courage is defined by endurance or perseverance of the soul. This seems to fulfill the necessary condition, but not the sufficient, because the counter argument is while courage always implies the endurance of the soul, and thus the endurance of the soul is necessary for courage, not every kind of endurance counts as courage, as there are also blameworthy kinds of endurance that would not qualify as a fine thing, as virtue, as is courage. So courage is a virtue which is, of course, praiseworthy. Sorry. The third attempt, this time it is proposed by Socrates, is just to add wise, or phronimos, to the second proposal, the second attempt. So it's wise endurance of the soul. Although this addition improved the definition insofar as it avoids counterexamples that were raised against the second attempt, it likewise does not provide a sufficient condition, for there are other cases of wise endurance that are not cases of courage, such as when a man shows endurance in spending his money wisely, knowing that this will bring a greater return. So this might be a virtuous action or virtuous behavior, but it is not the virtue of courage. So we have seen counterexamples which, on the one hand, so in the first case, demonstrate that the definition can fail because the definiens does not provide a necessary condition, or in the second and third case, because it does not provide a sufficient condition. This shows that in an adequate definition, the definiens must give both necessary and sufficient condition for the definiendum. In other words, it must satisfy the substitutivity requirement. Whereas the Laches does not give us a correct definition of courage until the end, so therefore it counts also as an aphoretic dialogue. Socrates nonetheless refers to another example, namely speed or quickness, to illustrate what he deems an adequate definition. This is T8. I mean something like this. Suppose I ask what speed is, which we find in running and in playing the lyre and in speaking and in learning and in many other instances. In fact, we may say we display the quality so far as it is worth mentioning in movements of the arm or legs or tongue or voice or thought. Or isn't it the way you too would express it? Yes, indeed. Then if anyone should ask me, Socrates, what do you say it is which you call swiftness? In all these cases, I would answer him that what I call swiftness is the power, so the dynamis, of accomplishing a great deal in a short time, whether in speech or in running or all other cases. So Socrates here claims that the dynamis to fulfill many things in a short time gives necessary and sufficient condition for tachytes, for speed or quickness, and thus counts as a successful definition. So I think this is quite interesting because with a definition of this kind, so we have at least an example, so a paradigm or a model for a good, for how a good definition should look like. And so we are not, so it's not completely aphoretic in this sense, but we have a kind of model, modest model for a good definition. So before turning to the two other requirements, I would like to point out a mistake often attributed to Socrates' interlocutors when they attempt to provide definitions. And I would like to point out that this mistake is in fact wrongly ascribed to them. Namely, so here I'm thinking, or I'm speaking about the confusion of particulars with universals. So this case was made in an article in a quite ancient or not very recent article by Alexander Nehamas, and I think it's really it's an important point, and because the mistake is still from time to time attributed to the interlocutors. So this error is detected, for example, so by some scholars in the Utif row or in the Hippias major, and it consists in assuming that instead of a general definiens, only a single example is given in response to a what is X question. So for example, Hippias' first attempt to define the beautiful is the following. My friend, I understand, I will indeed tell him what the beautiful is, and never will I be refuted. Listen, Socrates, who tells the truth, a beautiful girl is a beautiful thing. So how should this answer, so in Greek, parthenos, kale, kalon, be understood? Those who spot the confusion, a kind of category mistake, here understand the answer as though Hippias were citing an individual beautiful girl in response to the general question of what the beautiful is. This would make it clear that Hippias misunderstood the question and took it as the question of what something beautiful is, to which any single example can be given as a correct answer. But here I think it is noteworthy that Hippias does not reply with, in Greek, so I'm sorry for using some Greek, but I'm not sure if you read Greek or have some knowledge in Greek, but here, so one could also express the sentence by parthenos, kale, kale. So parthenos, it's a girl, and kale, so the first kale we have in the text, it's the adjective within the same gender as the name for girl, which is feminine. And then the second is here kale, so again a feminine and not a neutral. So this would on a linguistic level would be possible, and then the sentence would indeed be tautological and uninformative. But in the text, we have as the second adjective a neuter. So it seems important that the predicate in the question kalon is neuter and does not agree with the feminine subject parthenos kale. This suggests that the subject must be taken generally. So in the sense of any beautiful girl is beautiful, so that the expression does not refer to a particular beautiful girl, but to girls in general. And understood this way, Hippias does not commit the mistake of confusing particulars with universals. He's giving a general answer, though still, of course, not sufficiently general. And a similar point can also be made about the Euthyphro, and here Euthyphro's proposal to define the pious, namely by prosecuting his own father, prosecuting one's own father. This attempt to define the pious does not fail because it gives an individual example instead of a general answer. The problem is rather that the answer is not general enough, although it cites a general and instructive way of acting piously. So now I come to the paradigmatic requirement. This is certainly the most peculiar of the three and the most typical of the Platonic approach to the topic of definition. It is related to the third, the explanatory requirement, but it plays a distinct role in a genuine definition. Paradigms, or in Greek paradigmata, play an important role in Plato's dialogues and feature in many places, though not necessarily always in the same sense. The term paradigma primarily means example. This can be any example, but the term is often used more specifically to denote an example that is suitable as a model or a standard. To be a standard of F, for example, of being pious, is to be a criterion or measure against which one can hold up and measure putative F things or pious things and determine by comparison whether they are really cases of F. We encountered this criterion in T7, so the passage from the Euthyphro. And so it was in the last part, in the last paragraph, so that looking to it and using it as a paradigma, whatever is such as it is among the things either you or anyone else does, I shall say is pious, and what it is not, I shall say is not. So here Socrates states explicitly what I take to be the paradigmatic requirement. In asking what the pious is, Socrates is seeking an idea, so a form, but not in the full sense of form, that is suitable for being used as an example by which we can unambiguously decide whether things are pious or impious. This paradigmatic requirement is often understood as implying perfection. The standard against which pious things can be measured would therefore in a perfect and ideal sense be pious. Such an understanding necessarily leads to major difficulties for what exactly would be meant by perfect largeness or the perfect beautiful. I think the criterion makes much more sense if it is understood, for example, in analogy with the standard for a meter. So this was discussed also in the literature since some time. Once a standard for length has been established, it serves as a decisive measure against which all occurrences can be measured. This holds true regardless of whether this standard is in a perfect way, for example, a length. I believe it is this kind of aptness to serve as a standard that Plato has in mind when he sets out the paradigmatic criterion. Yet another factor plays a crucial role here, namely what is usually referred to as self-predication. Indeed, we encountered a typical case of this at the end of T5. So it was, do you say that this, so in D5, So in T5, D5, do you say that this thing itself is of a nature such as to be impious or such as to be pious? I, for one, should be annoyed at the question. I said, and I would say, don't commit sacrilege, fellow. Something else could hardly be pious if piety isn't itself to be pious. Remarkably, so the last one, so if not piety is pious, what else could be pious? So that implies clearly that piety is pious and given the standard of piety. Remarkably, self-predicate sentences, so sentences of the form the F itself is F, are always accepted by the different interlocutors without hesitation and as an almost self-evident fact. Indeed, failing to accept them seems virtually unthinkable. This strongly suggests that we should interpret these sentences as expressing something that is obviously true. This is more straightforward in Greek, as the generically abstract noun, the F, so the beautiful, is, and not the abstract noun, the Fness, is frequently used. Whereas it makes complete sense to say the triangle has 3 sides, it is nonsense to say triangularity has 3 sides. I think the same can be said for the pair the beauty is beautiful and the beautiful is beautiful. The latter seems to be much easier to accept than the former, because we can take it to be a generalization about beautiful things. What becomes important now, however, is the argument from relativity mentioned at the outset. The beautiful things about which a generalized statement is made, namely that the beautiful things are beautiful since this is what they have in common, it also follows that they can be not beautiful in other respects or at another time. This disqualifies them as a paradigm, according to Plato, for a standard for being F must not be not F in any respect, but must be exclusively F. This is, for example, a shortcoming that becomes evident in the various proposals regarding the beautiful in the Hippias Major. The proposal to define the beautiful by means of gold fails because for certain objects, such as the eyes of a statue or a heat-resistant cooking spoon, other materials such as ivory or olive wood prove more beautiful and suitable than gold. To accommodate this aspect, the following adjustment can be made. So we can say, we can formulate the self-predication assumption as the beautiful, or the F, qua F is always beautiful and never not beautiful. So if we understand self-predication in this sense, the extent to which appropriate definientia are intended to fulfill the paradigmatic requirement becomes clearer. A definition is considered good if the definiens is suitable to serve as a standard for determining whether something meets that definition, and this says nothing about the nature of the definiens. In particular, it leaves open whether it is a form. So now I'm coming to the last requirement, the explanatory requirement and the conclusion. The explanatory requirement is closely linked to the paradigmatic requirement, but goes beyond it and has a genuine impact. The crucial passage we have seen, so from the UT47, also provides evidence for this criterion. Well, this is mostly in the first part. But that form itself by which all the pious things are pious. So a question for you said, I think that it is by one idea, by one form, that the impious things are impious and the pious things pious. Socrates often uses this instrumental dative or formulation with dia and so through, and then a term referring to an idea or form in the in a non-technical sense. So that he often used the instrumental dative to express the explanatory relation between the form or the idea by which various things are made what they are. So we saw instances of this also in T3. So the passage from the Hippias Major, or is it, I think it's only 4. So here it was asked about, is it by justice that just things are just, and is it by wisdom that wise things are wise, and is it by the good that all good things are good? These passages make clear that an assumption which we might call the transmission assumption of causality is employed. It states that what makes something F must itself be F, since it makes things F by transmitting its being F to them. This transmission assumption was not entailed by the passage from the Euthyphron. The assumption there had simply been that for something to explain what it means to be F and to serve as a standard for it, it must itself be F. Yet there was no mention of a transmission of Fness from the F standard to the other F things. In other words, in the way in which the transmission takes place was left open. Admittedly, the nature of the transmission remains open even after the transmission theory is introduced. But it is at least specified insofar as it involves a transmitting cause of some kind. The transmission theory, which I take it pins down the explanatory requirement, becomes, for example, evident in a passage from the Hippias Major. So this one is not on the handout. I will read it briefly. If I had asked you from the beginning what is both beautiful and ugly, and you had given me the answer you just gave, then wouldn't you have given me the right answer? Do you still think that the beautiful itself, by which everything else is beautified and seen to be beautiful, when that form is added to it, that is a girl or a horse or a lion? I know it's on the handout. Yeah, it's the last text on the handout. The final sentence speaks of the beautiful itself, by which, for the instrumental dative, all the other things are beautified, so cosmetai, so made beautiful and appear beautiful when that form is added. And so added is prosgenetai, so it's really put on the or in the or in any kind transmitted to that thing. The description captures the instrumental or causal role of the beautiful and further specifies its function. The beautiful is that which renders beautiful objects beautiful by beautifying them and makes them appear beautiful when the eidos the form is added. So the verb adding or prosgenetai is ambiguous and open to different interpretations. Hippias, however, takes it literally and offers a proposal that conceives of the beautiful as a material substance, so adding gold to it. And in this case, so it would be a clear interpretation of what it means to transmit something. So you transmit the material substance to a thing. What I think becomes clear here is that Socrates holds that to be a proper definiens, when a thing has to fulfill this explanatory role, what means giving a reason or why the addition of something, why the addition of Fness explains why the definiendum holds. But so with this, there's not the transmission is still left quite open for interpretation, and only the middle or later dialogues by Plato will identify the forms then as the things that are the only adequate things to fulfill, especially this role in definitions. So here I'm finishing with a kind of operatic ending. So it's work in progress, I have to say. And yeah, and I spoke for a long time, so I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so before we turn to the questions, I'd just like to ask you, so we're gonna go now I can't say it, I said it before. Helvetia, for dinner, which is the place right over, you all know? The place right over there, I think I'm pointing in the right direction, yes. Yeah, good. So if you would like to come with us to dinner, please raise your hand and I'll take the count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. All right, let me just write this down. So now I'll write it down here. I'll write it down like that. 8. Is that it for you? Okay, so now okay, that's that question. Now questions if you have questions, now raise your hands. We're just raising our hands. Okay. All right. Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. So I have two questions actually. I think I can start with the first one and I can do the second one later. But I'm wondering about things like the large and the small, like Plato talks about them in the Phaedo and later in the Parmenides. Like how to make sense of defining large and small in some or words like it in virtue of these three requirements, right? Because sort of it seems that for them they really are relative in a certain sense, and it would be interesting to see how to make sense of those in view of these three requirements.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so it's of course this is an example from the middle dialogue. So it's not one that shows up in the early dialogue, because I think a specific characteristic maybe of the examples in the early dialogues is that we can understand, or that it makes to a certain extent sense to conceive of them also in a perfect sense. So we can of course imagine a perfect sense of courage or a perfect sense of beautiful, because all these are positive examples. And so large and small seem to be quite neutral. So there's not it's neither positive nor is it negative in a sense. Yeah, in a way it's, I think, so I would be inclined to think that this is one reason more for Plato to think we need as a proper definiens for those cases something of a special kind, namely forms, because here we get into trouble to think of other types of definientia, and the form is, so that for the example of largeness or equality also, there are, I think maybe for the case of equality it's easier than for largeness and smallness, so I will take this one first. So there are also the example what I was referring to of the meter is proposed for the explanation of largeness, and I think for equality. And I think even if you think of the of defining, I don't know how it's called in German, but dinar formats for papers, for example, then we even have a measure in an abstract sense, and also the meter nowadays. So it's not the meter in Paris, but it's really a physical definition of the meter. So we have to conceive of something in an abstract sense, in an immaterial sense, and if we have this for largeness as well, so but maybe another. So I was not proposing to exclude any kind of relativity from the realm of definientia or forms. So I think Plato meets the problem of having to address relativity also in the realm of forms, as he does of course, in the sophist, for example, there's talking about the relations between the forms. So relativity does not per se cause a problem for defining something. It's only for sensible things when they have their properties only relative to certain aspects, then it causes a problem. But relativity per se, so we could reproduce in a way a relativity also in the realm of forms. So this was a bit the answer to your question on the relativity properties of largeness and smallness. How do they meet the three requirements? I think Plato would assume that we can think of largeness and smallness in a paradigmatic sense. So we can have a standard of largeness and of smallness in relation to which we can measure if a thing is large or counts as large or counts as small. And if the explanatory role of proper definientia is to explain how different particulars that have that property get that property, and this is the role of the forms, then I think this goes well for largeness and smallness as well. Yeah, I see the problem more in the relativity of those examples and the non-perfection of those examples. Yeah.
Can I do like a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
So I find this really interesting because sort of there's also like the question of like measure as you were talking about, like with the meter and stuff like that. And because it seems that when we say large or something, we're saying like larger than something else, right? And when we're talking about measure, it seems that we're also introducing sort of we're measuring with regards to something, and that something is often like a concrete thing, right? Instead of an abstract thing, like with maybe like the before the meter was like a concrete thing that we had, or like the Egyptian cubits or something like that. It was like it met the paradigmatic requirement, but the paradigm wasn't an abstract thing. It was like a concrete thing that we had. I was thinking that maybe largeness and smallness could be understood like that, but with having like a concrete paradigm instead of an abstract paradigm.
Yeah. I think so. This goes beyond the text, but I think Plato would not completely refuse the option that there are examples, as for example also the case of speed, but also the examples that he offers as models, as paradigmata in the Meno, so color, for example, where we have concrete or empirical standards to measure against which we can measure. So it may turn out that there are examples mainly from the empirical side for which an empirical measure is completely adequate. Therefore, I was also more suggesting that there are cases for which forms are necessary on the other side. And I think maybe we can think of two senses of largeness. So we have this empirical sense of largeness for which an empirical standard might be adequate, but we can also maybe the generosity of this person is larger than the generosity of this person, and then we have an immaterial measure. And if we really allow this very wide sense of largeness, then we could have both. So maybe that causes different problems in Plato, because then we have many forms of largeness, but maybe these are just species of a genus of largeness. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. My question is concerned about, I mean, in the level of applied linguistics. And
Sorry.
my question starts with a question that it is mentioned that can we have a dialogue in the daily life without a kind of pre-acceptance of the definition? And if the answer is no, then we need to have some definitions as you provide some criteria for that. I think that these requirements for an adequate definition is very strict, and they finally led Plato to a kind of linguistic solipsism, because there would be not a lot of terms which have solid definitions, as you have mentioned, with these criteria. So, briefly speaking, I think a very maybe a big objection would be that if we believe in these criteria for an adequate definition, then we might be living in a kind of personal, individualistic world, because but in our experience, we experience something different. We talk to each other without kind of predefined definitions, without any acceptance and these requirements. So I want to ask that how Plato solved this problem in his systematic philosophy. If these are the adequate criteria for good definition, then he should also answer this question: how we have an ordinary dialogue to each other in our daily life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's the issue you mentioned is partly also connected with what Peter Geach called the Socratic fallacy. So how we can get started to talk about something if all exchange about common subject requires that we have a definition beforehand. And given that the requirements for a correct definition are as high, it seems almost impossible. And so because of that, so I skipped that passage, but I agree with those who object to this identification of a fallacy on Socrates' side. But also this diagnosis of Peter Geach, and I accept that we need a kind of distinction between different types of knowledge. So let's say either we make a distinction between a true opinion, so we start with opinions and we can very well and discuss to each other with true opinions that's sufficient for the daily life. But when we meet hard cases to decide, for example, if we really have to decide if that action or that action is the courageous or is the virtuous action, then we enter maybe a discussion on the real nature or on what makes one action more courageous or virtuous than another action. And then we require more explanation for what you understand by this and what I'm understanding by this. So we could go that way. So this was the idea of Terry Irwin, or we can have something of an fallible and an infallible knowledge. So for we need these kinds of definitions for infallible knowledge, whereas we can have fallible knowledge, what we have of most of the daily life things. So we have fallible knowledge of when my train starts, or so normally we just rely on fallible knowledge. And so I think it's necessary to have some preliminary opinions, but we just have a very strong notion of knowledge here. So when Socrates or when also Aristotle is attributing knowledge to Plato or to Socrates, then this is a very peculiar, strong sense of knowledge. And I think it's acceptable, and I think it's also the same thing as Aristotle is doing then later on in the second and the posterior analytics, to have a very strong concept of knowledge, which requires definitions. But that does not exclude daily life conversations.
So the solution is to have a kind of differentiation between the level of our discourse. In a very, for example, high quality kind of knowledge, we have to apply these criteria, but for the ordinary language, we don't need to do the same thing. So another question here arises that, I mean, the relation of these different levels of discourse to the concept of nonsense. I want to formulate this question like that. So if in our daily life, in the daily and ordinary language, we just share our opinion without kind of pre-accepted kind of definition, then again, we have the problem here, the problem of linguistic solipsism, because again, in this case, we are talking to each other without having a kind of accepted definition. And here, I think that there would be a better to be a kind of Wittgensteinian philosopher to apply the Plato idea, because in that sense you can solve this problem easily. But if you want to just say that, oh no, we have different levels of discourse, and in this level of knowledge, we don't need to define the terms and definitions accurately. So we comprise and just leave it for later. But no, this discourse is very important, or I don't know. We need to just have a kind of accepted definition. So I think the conception, the objection is still remain, even if we discriminate and differentiate between different levels of knowledge in discourse.
Yeah, no, maybe you might have misunderstood what I was saying. So I was not saying that it's just very only based on conventions and exchange, a verbal exchange about some common things. But I was speaking, for example, of true opinions. So here we have truth. Or I was speaking of fallible knowledge. So here we have knowledge. So it has certain requirements, but a different sort of definitional requirements as in the in other discourses, or in the pre-theoretical discourses. So you can also give a certain account of something you are talking about, but it's not necessary also for this what I call pre-theoretical account. It's not necessary yet to give this proper definition in the sense which is based on these requirements. But it's not just conventional discourse or something like that. But it's not the Wittgensteinian neither. So.
Thank you for that. So I'm a little bit maybe I just don't understand. So is the idea that we require 1, 2, and 3, like all 3 must be true to be a good definition? But they're all required. Okay, so then I just have the question that how general is the substitutivity requirement? So is it substitution salva veritate in all contexts or only for predications?
So it depends on how the definition is formulated. So the definition can be formulated either for predicates or for nouns. But then, yes, in all contexts.
In all contexts. But then I suspect that there is a tension between 1 and 3, because for example, it's definiens, it must explain the application of definiendum. I cannot swap the definiendum and definiens.
Right, yeah.
So there is an asymmetry, right, in the explanatory requirement, which is going to cause trouble with substitutivity. Simply because if I substitute in every requirement, the definiendum is going to do the explanatory work.
Good. Now it's meant on speaking on in an extensional sense of the substitutivity, and then the explanatory argument, which is an asymmetric criterion, and this brings in an intentional dimension. So that's the idea. So it's not on the
It's not everywhere. So they're not synonymous expressions.
No.
Yeah. That's-
So the second and the third are asymmetric.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you very much. You're asking us at a certain point the ontological status, okay, of the referent of these names, that stands for forms. And you said that towards the end that there is mistake, not to be to Socrates, the confusion between particulars and related.
Yeah.
Now, you have spoken about the early dialogues, and you have treated these forms maybe as universal, probably, because we have talked about universal definition. Now, if we move to middle and late dialogues, we can open again in case this question, and or not. I mean, can we open again this question? And,
If there's a
that
confusion.
yes, about the confusion. And we think forms are particular example.
Yeah, so the idea of this confusion, of this objection of confusing particulars and universals was meant for cases where as a particular is proposed as a definiens for a definiendum which is clearly a universal. So we have a particular girl or a particular pot, or I don't know, or particular action as the general definition for pious things or for beautiful things. I was not referring using particular to the idea which gets to be defined. So if your question is, does Plato conceive of forms as particulars, or not, maybe not particulars, but individual things? Yeah, I would conceive of forms as hybrid entities. Yeah, because they are, they have characteristics which I take to be universal, and they have characteristics which I take to be individuals.
So
But that's another problem. So yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. No. It's a great problem, and but it was not this category mistake which I was referring to in the literature. So this was just but I think it's very interesting, and so I think the problem shows up in the later dialogues in the context of the self-predication or self-predicative sentences, and because these sentences we find, or the star instances of self-predications we find mostly in the early dialogues. It's a problem which so the sources of the problem are present in the early dialogues as well. Yeah.
Thank you for the time. I have just a clarification about the passage T6. Could you just like few words say what was the big out of this passage? What was meant this passage to do?
Yes, reading the passage, I think I left out parts of the passage I wanted to quote. So there's at this point in the discussion, so Socrates asked a question of decision to Protagoras. So he asked Protagoras if he would accept that the 5 names for these, so the name courage, the name temperance, the name wisdom, the name justice, and the name piety are 5 names for one thing. So different names with only one single referent, or do we have really 5 names with 5 different referents, namely the different parts of the virtue of excellence? So the question is, who the different single virtues are 5 separate virtues, or is there a unity of the virtues so that we have 5 names but all have the same reference, so we have the unity of the virtues? And I think it's interesting because here we really have the distinction between the linguistic level of names and the non-linguistic levels of the reference of the different names. And it's a question about the, so.
Because when I read the passage, instead of focusing on the distinction between language level and logical level, I was thinking more something like about when it comes to virtues, we can at least describe two positions. One, according to which to be virtues, you have to have all virtues. And the other one in which you can have virtues separately, so you can be courageous without being wise, for example. And so what I was thinking about this passage was more something like, do you think that to be virtuous, you have to have all virtues together, or can you have just separate ones?
Yeah. So in the end, I think it's this question which is at stake in the Protagoras. So it's not just a study in philosophy of language. So the interest is not on making us aware of the difference between the linguistic and the non-linguistic level, but it's operating with this distinction between the two levels in discussing the question of exactly if there's a unity of the virtues, which would exclude that you could be virtuous in one way but not virtuous in the other, or if we have this unity of the virtues, which seems to be the position of Plato Socrates, that in the end all virtues are a kind of knowledge or wisdom. So and this would make it impossible to be courageous but not temperate. Yeah.
Thanks. My first question is actually related to Giovanni's one, so the last one. So if you look at the three requirements that you listed, so the substitutivity requirement seems to be more linguistic, and the second one, clearly ontological, I mean, seems like. And the third one, where the formulation of it that you provided seems like you want to push toward the linguistic side. But if you look at T10, actually seems way more ontological.
Why do you think the third one goes more in the direction of?
No, well, it's because of your formulation. Let's explain the application of its definition. So so if you just want to say, let's explain why the definition is the case, which is how I would have formulated it, and then of course it's ontological. But I was just wondering whether there was any reason why you wanted to phrase it that way. So let's explain the application of its definition, which is way more linguistic. Right?
Yes. No. Maybe in this case, I would understand it. So as I explained it, it's intimately connected to this idea of a certain kind of causality, the transmission causality, and this is of course an ontological relation. So I wanted to have it in an ontological, or I understood it in an ontological way, and I completely agree that the formulation is not expressing this, and I would go for another formulation for this case. Yeah.
Just the standard why is definition is the case. Why
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And can I ask you a question? Go ahead. I forgot which question you just did. Oh yes, that's more of provocation than anything else. What exactly is the problem with self-verification? Having one in Plato. I mean, you also addressed it as a problem and something we should basically try to avoid, etc., etc. But as you said, in T5 is perfectly fine there, and I don't think we can actually. I mean, I don't think that the usual trick of saying, well, it's a problem because in ordinary language, blah blah blah, we have this weird thing that we want to avoid. We don't want to say beautiful is beautiful, but that beautiful is beautiful. Yeah. So what exactly is the problem that you are addressing?
No,
because
I thought so. I didn't take any position
Yeah,
on
no,
the-
I noticed that.
on
That's exactly why
yeah.
the
So
question-
I
why the question is
just
hard.
avoided. So I maybe because I so half of my dissertation was on self-predication. So I thought a bit about and it's so because no, there are a lot of authors that see a great problem in self-predication. So but what I was saying about self-predication was more basically referring to how it is, how it shows up in the dialogues and how the reactions of different interlocutors are confronted with the self-predications. And normally they go just, they are accepted without hesitation. So they are accepted not as tautologies. So they are accepted as something which it's worth to be said, but which is obviously true, or which is eminently true in a way. So maybe it's so it's expressing that the beautiful is the first and most beautiful thing. So if not the beautiful is beautiful, what else could be beautiful? So this is the main way I think how self-predications are introduced in the dialogues and are get accepted. But so for the problem, I think it's quite. So when getting to the middle or later dialogues, there are examples or forms for which it's quite we get quite quickly contradictory sayings if we accept self-predicative sentences. So the form kinesis if it's the most moving thing. So yeah, so these are the typical cases which prima facie cause problems for the theory of forms. But also there, I think there exist a lot of attractive responses to this problem. So we could qualify, we can speak of the form as a form, or we could speak of the form of kinesis as the form of kinesis. And then it makes sense to say the form of kinesis is moving. And I accept that. And in the end, because my dissertation was on the third man, and in the end, I think that not the self-predication premise is the problem for the third man, but it's more the non-identity premise, which causes problems for Plato's theory of forms. So in the end, I agree with you that self-predication is not a major problem in Plato, but it needs some explanation why it is not a problem. And the problem does not, or the apparent problem does not arise with the examples we met here, but with the harder cases in the later dialogues.